At the moment, just because we are managing two separate timers to control the state of the stopwatch, one timer is global and another one is local, which belongs to any of these stopwatch components. And due to that reason, the code seems a lot more confusing than it could have been. Plus, we have an issue with our current implementation, so let's start tracking the time for a particular activity. As we can see on the progress page, this time is increasing, but what if we're gonna switch tabs, and then, after some time, we'll come back to the tab with our application. In this case, we're going to see that this time is no longer increasing. So stopwatch stops automatically whenever we switch tabs, or in other words, when tab with our application becomes inactive, and stopwatch will continue counting the time if we'll switch to timeline page, because once we're on this page, local stopwatches get initialized. So in this lesson, I prefer to do a global refactoring of the logic that belongs to controlling the state of stopwatches. So in the timeline items module, we have a couple of functions such as start timeline item timer as well as stop timeline item timer to manage the state of the global timer. But besides that, every timeline stopwatch component has its own local state, which is encapsulated inside this composable function useStopwatch. Let's open up this function, and here we can see functions start and stop that manage local state of the stopwatch. As we can see, every second reactive variable seconds gets updated, and we are watching for changes in this variable inside timeline stopwatch component, and every time when this variable is updated, we are updating timeline item object by calling this function update timeline item. In this case, we are updating the property activity seconds of timeline item object every second as our stopwatch continues running, and also we are watching for changes in its running reactive variable, and this variable is updated only when we either start or stop stopwatch, because in this case we have to update another property of timeline item object, which is active, since every timeline item object which has stopwatch running is considered to be active, and vice versa. So now let's start refactoring the code to eventually get rid of the local stopwatches. So let's begin with a function which starts timeline item timer. In here, I'm going to rename this parameter on just timeline item. And before we actually start a global timer, we have to update isActive property of timeline item object, just like we are doing in here when we were watching for changes in its running reactive variable. So when the global timeline item timer will be started, that means that isActive property should be true. And of course, we do not have access to the props object in this global function, so to determine which timeline item we have to update, instead of referencing props object, we're simply going to forward timeline item object that we have received as a parameter in this function, like this. And now let's switch to a different function, function stop, to stop the stopwatch. So right here, in order to stop the stopwatch, we are firstly clearing interval to prevent previously started timer from running any longer. And besides that, we also have to assign value false to reactive variable isRunning. But the thing is that this reactive variable isRunning is the state of the local stopwatch, but we are trying to remove all the logic related to local stopwatches, because eventually what we are trying to achieve is actually have only one state variable that will be the state of a global timer, and such variable in our case is this timeline item timer variable. So let's turn this variable into reactive variable by calling function ref. On the initial page load, stopwatch is not started, so we'll use value false as an initial value in here. And everywhere we were using timeline item timer variable before, now since it's a reactive variable, we'll have to use property value like this when we assign reference to the timer, as well as when we clear this timer right here. As we can see before, we were also manually assigning value false to variable isRunning, so let's do the same for our global state. Let's assign value false to timeline item timer variable, like so. And besides doing that, we also have to update property isActive of that timeline item object we are stopping the stopwatch for. So right here we have to call update timeline item and update property isActive by assigning value false, since we are stopping the timer in this case. And in addition to these two functions for starting and stopping the timer, we also had another action, which is resetting the time of the timer. So we have to create similar function, but for the global timer. Right here I'm going to export a new function with the name reset timeline item timer, which is about to receive one parameter timeline item object. And resetting the timer basically means assigning value 0 to property activity seconds of timeline item object. So right here let's also call update timeline item function and specify in this case that we would like to update only one property, which is activity seconds, by assigning value 0. And just because along with resetting the time for a stopwatch, we also had to stop the stopwatch, so right here let's call the function which is going to stop our stopwatch, stop timeline item timer, and pass that timeline item object stopwatch of which we are about to stop. The next thing we're going to do is move this watch effect function call into global timeline items module. And what this watch effect was doing before, it was actually watching for time updates and whenever current hour was changing, and at the same time if we had stopwatch running, in that case we had to automatically stop the stopwatch, and that is why we're calling function stop right here. But because currently we are in the global scope and we don't have access to the props object, we need to somehow find out which timeline item object is currently active. In other words, stopwatch of which timeline item object is running. We can easily find out which timeline item object is currently active. So for that, I'm going to create new computed property with the name activity timeline item. And what this property is going to do is basically going to iterate over array of timeline item objects and look for that timeline item where isActive property will be true. In this way, we will find active timeline item object. So now inside this conditional, let's reference our active timeline item computed property, and before checking if hour of this timeline item object does not equal to current hour, we also have to make sure that we even have active timeline item. So before that, I'm going to add an additional check. So we no longer need to check the value of isRunning reactive variable. Let's get rid of it from here. So in order to stop the timer, we have to reference function stop timeline item timer instead of this function stop. And to tell this function which stopwatch we have to stop, we'll simply pass active timeline item object into this function like so. And this way there is a bunch of code that can be removed from timeline stopwatch component. Let's open up this component and remove unnecessary code, such as this function onMounted, this watch effect, as well as this watcher. Also we had to conditionally determine which button to show, either button to stop the stopwatch or start the stopwatch. But if before we were using isRunning local reactive variable, this time, since we're going to control state of the stopwatch globally, we have to reference different variable, which is timeline item timer. And since we can only show the pause button for the timeline item which corresponds to the current hour, let's add additional check in here and see if hour of current timeline item object equals to the current hour. That means we can show pause button. Let's keep going, and regarding this function start, now it is called start timeline item timer. So let's call this function and specify which timeline item object we're going to start stopwatch for. And basically the same thing should be done to stop function. Let's replace this function with stop timeline item timer and pass first parameter, which is timeline item object we are about to stop the timer for. And eventually we end up with only one function reset that we are still receiving from composable function stopwatch. So let's change function reset and use new function reset timeline item timer. And as always, we need to pass which timeline item object we are resetting the time for. So at the end, stopwatch composable function is no longer needed. So we can open up the file with this composable, which is stopwatch.js, and simply remove it. There are a bunch of unused imports in this component. Let's remove each of them. And instead we should import a bunch of things from timeline item module. Mainly those are the functions that allow us to manage state of the global stopwatch. So let's just import them one by one in here. First of all, it is a function to start global timer, then function to stop it. Also we need a function to reset the time of the stopwatch. And also in this component, we are referring to timeline item timer variable, which stores reference to the global timer. By the way, there is no need to assign props object to the constant props, since we're not going to reference any props in the script tag. But as for referencing them inside the template, we don't need to explicitly reference props object, so we can remove this assignment as well as all those mentions of a props object from the template. Now let's go back to timeline items module, and since I prefer to group all variable declarations as well as computed property declarations in one place, let's move this computed property closer to all reactive variables right here. And there is also function with a name find active timeline item, which is pretty similar to the computed property active timeline item. It is doing the same thing, so there is no need to keep this function anymore. Let's remove it, and whenever we were referencing this function, let's refactor this part of code by simply using active timeline item computed property instead. So let's import this property from timeline items module, and additionally, whenever we are referencing this active timeline item variable, we have to get the underlying value of this property by referencing property value like this. And also in here, when we are passing active timeline item object to start timeline item timer function. And as you may remember before, whenever we would open up timeline page, we had to always stop global timeline item timer. Otherwise, after local timers will be initialized, we'll end up with two timers running at the same time, which we don't want. But now, since we completely got rid of local timers, there is no need to stop global timeline item timer, since we're always going to have only one timeline item timer running at the same time. Let's remove this function call as well as its import. And by the way, we also have to export additional variable from timeline items module, which is timeline item timer variable. So let's add an export keyword in here. And we can also make this variable a constant, since we're not going to override the value in this variable, because we are only going to modify value property of this object. So now, after doing so many changes, we have to make sure that our application still functions correctly. Let's start tracking the time, then stop this timer to see if we still can do it. Then let's start it again and reset the time of this stopwatch. So far everything is working. Let's see if stopwatch will still be running after page refresh. This is also working. And now let's assign activity to this timeline item object and make sure that the time on the progress page will be increasing. As we can see, it works. On the activities page, this time should be decreasing. And if we're gonna refresh the page, while not being on the timeline page, this time will still be increasing. But as for that problem that we have faced at the beginning of this lesson, whenever I would open up a different tab and then come back to the tab with our application, in this case, we can see that the timer was stopped. And since the current lesson has gotten quite long, let's work on this problem in the next one. Link to the source code of this project will be in the video description.